What happens when the most feared man in New Orleans falls to his knees? Not for a rival, not for a judge, not for a federal indictment, but for a 6-year-old girl who hasn't spoken a single word in 8 months. She wasn't a therapist. She wasn't a child psychologist with a wall full of credentials. She was a broke, heavyset waitress from the Tremé who just needed to keep her lights on, and the little girl who had shut the whole world out. She whispered her first word in 8 months into that woman's ear like it was the most natural thing she'd ever done. Raphael Donatello Arcadi was not a man who asked for help. He was a man who sent people to ask for things on his behalf, and those people didn't use the word ask. He ran the Arcadi syndicate the way his grandfather had built it, from the shadows with patience and with a particular talent for making problems disappear quietly into the brackish water of Lake Pontchartrain. His name wasn't in any newspaper. It didn't need to be. Everyone in New Orleans who mattered already knew it, and everyone who didn't matter learned it eventually, usually at the worst possible moment. He was 41 years old, broad-shouldered, silver, beginning to thread through his dark hair at the temples, and he had not smiled, genuinely smiled, in a very long time. The reason was Sophia. Sophia Arcadi was 6 years old, with her late mother's wide brown eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, and she had not spoken since the night 11 months ago when she had watched federal agents crash through the front door of their St. Charles Avenue home, scream at her in the foyer with guns drawn, and drag her father away in handcuffs while her nanny clutched her and told her to look away. "Look away, baby. Don't look." Raphael had been back home inside 36 hours. The charges were a fishing expedition. The government's case dissolved like sugar in rain. But the damage to Sophia had already been done. The doctors said it was selective mutism triggered by acute trauma. They said it with careful clinical voices in offices, with soft lighting and tissue boxes on every table. They recommended play therapy. They recommended EMDR. They recommended patience. Raphael had written enormous checks to 3 different specialists. He had hired a highly recommended child therapist who came to the house 4 afternoons a week. He had made his entire household whisper and walk softly and remove anything that could startle her. He had read every book they gave him, sat through every session, and watched his daughter stare at the wall while gentle professionals asked her gentle questions she never answered. He had also gone through 4 nannies in 8 months, not because of Sophia's behavior. Sophia was heartbreakingly quiet. She simply refused to eat when a nanny fed her, refused to sleep when they sat outside her door, refused to hold their hands when they walked her anywhere. She would look at them with those huge, unreadable eyes and go somewhere else inside herself, somewhere none of them could reach. The last one, a seasoned professional from a highly regarded domestic placement agency with 12 years of experience and references from 2 former ambassadors, had lasted 11 days before she came to Raphael's study, set her resignation letter on his desk, and said very quietly that she was sorry, but she didn't think she was the right fit. Raphael had stared at the letter for a long time after she left. His head of household operations, a dry-humored man named Fenwick, who had been with the Arcadi family since before Raphael was born, had found the next candidate. "She's not what you've been hiring," Fenwick said, setting a slim folder on Raphael's desk the following morning. "Tell me she has experience with children." "She does. 3 years working after-school programs in the 7th Ward, 2 years as a mother's helper for a family in Metairie. No formal nanny certifications, no degree." Raphael looked up from the folder. "Then what is she?" Fenwick was quiet for a moment. "She's the only person who applied who mentioned in her cover letter that she isn't afraid of silence. Her name was Bette Louise Mouton. She was 26 years old, 5 feet 3 inches tall, and she weighed, by her own frank assessment when she'd filled out the agency's health form, somewhere in the neighborhood of 270 pounds. She had a round face, warm amber brown eyes, and a gap between her front teeth that appeared when she smiled, which she did often and without self-consciousness. She had grown up in the Tremé in a shotgun house with her grandmother, her mother who worked double shifts at University Medical Center, and a rotating cast of cousins who needed watching. She had been watching other people's children since she was 11 years old. She was good at it the way some people are good at listening, naturally, without having to try, without needing to be thanked for it. She currently worked the breakfast and lunch shift at a counter diner on Magazine Street called Tante Lulu's, where she had been employed for 4 years and where she was, by universal agreement of the regular customers, the best thing about the place. She brought coffee before you asked for it. She remembered that the man at the corner table took his eggs over medium and his toast unbuttered because of his cholesterol. She could carry 4 full plates on one arm and never spilled a drop. She needed this job because the diner's owner had recently told her that he was selling Tante Lulu's, and Bette had 3 months before the place closed, and she needed to figure out her life. She also had her grandmother's medical bills. Mamie Louise had been in and out of Tulane Medical for a heart condition since spring, and the co-pays were adding up in ways that made Bette's stomach hurt when she thought about them late at night. She arrived at the Arcadi residence on a Tuesday in October. The gate was iron. The wall surrounding the property was old New Orleans brick, climbing with jasmine, and topped with something she didn't let herself look at too closely. The house itself was a grand double-gallery colonial set back from the street, cream-colored with dark green shutters, the kind of house that had been expensive for 200 years and intended to stay that way. A man with a coiled wire behind his ear opened the front door before she reached the top porch step. Inside, she was walked to a formal sitting room and told to wait. Bette sat on the edge of a silk-upholstered chair and did not fidget. She was nervous, but she had learned young that being nervous and showing it were 2 separate things she didn't have to do at the same time. She pressed her damp palms flat on her thighs and looked around the room. At the plaster medallion on the ceiling, at the oil painting of a coastal storm above the fireplace, at the enormous antique armoire in the corner that probably cost more than her grandmother's entire house. Raphael Arcadi walked in and the room changed temperature. He was tall, and he moved like someone who had never once in his adult life needed to make himself smaller to fit into a space. He wore a dark charcoal suit, no tie, his collar open 2 buttons. He stopped just inside the doorway and looked at her. Bette stood and extended her hand. "Mr. Arcadi, I'm Bette Mouton." He shook it. His grip was brief and exact. He sat across from her and said nothing immediately, which was its own kind of test, and Bette knew it, so she waited. "You wrote something in your letter," he said finally, "about silence." "Yes? What did you mean by it?" Bette considered how to say it. "Children who stop talking aren't broken," she said. "They're waiting for someone who's not going to flinch at the quiet, not going to try to fill it up, not going to need something from them. Most people can't stand silence. They have to fix it. I don't need to fix it." She paused. "I grew up in a house with a grandmother who spent whole afternoons not saying a word. I learned you can be with someone completely without talking at all." Raphael studied her for a long moment. She did not look away. "My daughter," he said, "has been evaluated by 4 specialists. She has a therapist who sees her multiple times a week. She is not, as you said, broken. She is also not going to respond to someone who needs her to perform recovery on their timeline. I understand. The position pays significantly above market rate. Weekly in cash. You would live on the premises." He named the figure. Bette kept her face level and did not let the number show on it. It was enough to cover Mamie Louise's bills for a year and still have something left. "I understand," she said again. "You would be told very little about this household's operations," Raphael said. "You would be expected to ask very few questions. You would focus entirely on Sophia. That's what I'm here for." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Not warmth exactly, more like the small recalibration of a man reassessing his original read of a situation. He looked at her, really looked, the way he looked at everyone, taking inventory, and she felt it without flinching. "I'll need to see how she responds to you," he said. Sophia was in the second-floor playroom. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor beside a low wooden table, arranging small glass animals in a line. Bears, elephants, deer, a giraffe with a chipped neck, with precise, unhurried care. She did not look up when Bette and Raphael came in. Fenwick and the day nurse positioned themselves near the door. Raphael stood near the window with his arms folded, watching. Bette walked to the corner of the room and sat down on the floor. Not near Sophia, not crowding her, just in the room, at her level. She looked at the shelf of books along the wall. She didn't say anything. A full minute passed. Then, too, Raphael's jaw tightened. He was about to speak when Bette reached into the deep pocket of her cardigan. She'd been told this was an interview, but she'd come prepared anyway, and pulled out a small piece of wax paper folded around something. She unfolded it quietly, set a single beignet on the paper in front of her, and went back to looking at the books. The smell reached across the room. Fried dough and powdered sugar, and something warm and unmistakably New Orleans. Sophia's hand stilled on the glass giraffe. She did not look up for another minute. Then, slowly, with the exaggerated casualness of a child, pretending not to be interested in something that had completely arrested her attention, she turned her head. Bette didn't look at her. She broke a small piece off the beignet, ate it, and made a quiet sound of satisfaction, like it was the finest thing she'd tasted all week. Sophia set down the giraffe. She stood up, which nobody in the room had been expecting, and she walked, in her small, deliberate way, across the room. She stopped 2 feet from Bette and looked at the beignet. Bette tore off a piece and held it out without looking at the girl, the way you'd offer something to a skittish animal you didn't want to alarm. Sophia took it. She ate it. She stood there. Then she sat down next to Bette on the floor. They sat together and finished the beignet in total silence, looking at the bookshelves, while every adult in the room held their breath and tried not to move. Raphael watched his daughter sit voluntarily beside another human being for the first time in 8 months, and felt something crack open in his chest, something he didn't have a name for, something he'd been pressing down so hard for so long he'd almost convinced himself it didn't exist. Fenwick caught his eye from across the room and said nothing, which was how Fenwick communicated approval. Raphael cleared his throat. "Miss Mouton?" he said quietly. "When can you start?" Living in the Accardi house was like living on a ship in the middle of the ocean. All the normal rules of land did not apply. Everything was its own closed system, and you learned very quickly what your role was and stayed inside it. Bette moved into the East Wing suite on a Thursday. Her room was 3 times the size of her apartment in the Tremé, and had a clawfoot bathtub and windows that looked out over the walled garden. She lay on the bed her first night and stared at the ceiling plaster and thought very deliberately and very clearly that this was a job she needed. She would do it well, and she would stay in her lane, and she would not make anything complicated. She made nothing complicated. She simply showed up every morning at the same time and sat with Sophia. She did not demand interaction. She read books aloud, not to Sophia, just in the room, as if she were reading to herself. She colored in coloring books, slowly and painstakingly, making small comments to no one in particular. "I don't think this elephant is actually gray. I think he's more of a blue-gray. What do you think?" And then not waiting for an answer, just moving on, letting the observation float into the air and dissolve. She introduced a second coloring book and set it beside her own without comment. On the 4th day, Sophia picked up a blue crayon and began to color beside her. Bette didn't react. She just slid the box closer so Sophia could reach it. On the 7th day, she was in the kitchen making red beans and rice for herself. The cook, A formal man named Aldridge had agreed with the careful dignity of a man managing a very delicate territorial arrangement to allow her use of the kitchen after 6 p.m. When she heard the door open behind her, she turned. Sophia was standing in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, her dark hair loose around her face, holding her glass giraffe. "Couldn't sleep?" Bette said, as if it were the most ordinary thing. She pulled out a stool from the island without ceremony. "Come sit with me." Sophia climbed up onto the stool. She watched Bette stir the pot. The kitchen smelled like bay leaf and andouille, and something deep and savory that had been simmering all evening. "My grandmother taught me to make this," Bette said, not looking at her. Her grandmother taught her. Goes back that way a long time. There's something nice about that, I think. Like you're not really alone in the kitchen. All those women who came before, they're kind of in there with you. She tasted the spoon, considered it. Needs another minute. Sophia was quiet. But she was present. And in Bette's experience, presence was the beginning of everything. They were in the kitchen, had been in the kitchen together 6 nights in a row by this point, when Raphael came in at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday, having come from wherever men like him went in dark suits at 10 p.m. on a Wednesday, and found them both sitting at the island, Bette eating red beans and rice, Sophia with a small bowl of the same in front of her, and the two of them looking at pictures in an old copy of National Geographic. He stopped in the doorway. Sophia had a spoon in her hand and sauce on her chin, which Bette was pretending not to notice, so Sophia wouldn't be embarrassed. Raphael looked at his daughter the way a man looks at something he was afraid he'd lost and has found again. Carefully, not wanting to startle it, not quite believing it's still there. He walked quietly to the island and sat on the stool on the other side of Bette. He looked at the magazine. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "Antarctic Expedition," Bette said. "From 1984. We found it in the library. Sophia likes the penguins." He looked at the page. He didn't say anything else, and neither did Bette, and Sophia turned the page to more penguins, and the three of them sat in the kitchen past 11, in a silence that was, for the first time Raphael could remember, not heavy with absence. He noticed the flour on Bette's apron. She'd been baking something earlier. He could smell it. Something sweet and vanilla warm that had settled into the air of the whole east wing. He noticed the way she'd tucked a napkin under Sophia's bowl without drawing attention to it. He noticed that she wasn't performing calm for his benefit. That she actually was calm, the way some people are, not because nothing touched them, but because they had decided what to do with what touched them. He noticed, against his better judgment, quite a few other things as well. He had spent 20 years with women who were precisely calibrated, socialites who understood what his name meant and positioned themselves accordingly. Women his late wife's family had introduced him to, women his associates considered appropriate. His wife, Katerina, had been beautiful and sharp-tongued and ferociously intelligent, and he had loved her, and she had died in the passenger seat of his car, on a night when it was raining and a driver who had run a red light had made a decision that changed everything. He had not been looking at any woman in particular since. He had told himself he was not looking. He was, apparently, looking now. He tucked that fact away with the same cold discipline he applied to everything else and stood up from the island. "Good night, Sophia," he said. His daughter looked up at him with her enormous eyes and did not speak. He had learned, slowly and painfully, not to need her to. He kissed the top of her head. "Good night, Miss Mouton," he said. "Good night, Mr. Riccardi," Bette said, and went back to the penguins. He stood in the hall for a moment after the kitchen door closed and breathed in the vanilla-warm air and thought about absolutely nothing for a count of 10. Then he went upstairs. The threat came on the 3rd week. It came in the form of a man named Galt. No first name, or none he offered, who appeared behind Bette at the farmer's market on Magazine Street on a Saturday morning, where she had gone with Fenwick's permission to buy okra and a few other things she needed, with one of Raphael's security men, a quiet, watchful person named Dumas, walking 20 feet behind her. Gault was thin and tobacco-weathered, and he walked beside her like they were old friends. "You work for Arcady now," he said. It was not a question. Bette kept walking. "I work for a private family, the little girl," Gault said. "She ever go outside alone? The school she goes to, she going back? They do drop off at the side entrance on Prytania, yeah?" Every hair on Bette's neck stood up. She did not break stride. She did not look at him. She shifted her bag to her left arm and pressed her right hand once, flat against her thigh, a signal she and Dumas had rehearsed, just in case, the very first day, because Raphael's household was nothing if not prepared for exactly this kind of situation. 20 seconds later, Gault was no longer beside her. She did not look back. She continued to the opera stand, selected what she needed, paid for it, and then walked back to the car on steady legs that she did not allow to shake until she was inside and the door was closed. Dumas drove. She sat in the back and breathed. "He asked about Sophia's school schedule," she said. "I know." Dumas' voice was flat. "I heard him. Arcady will know before we reach the gate." He did. Raphael was waiting in the foyer when they arrived, and one look at his face told her that whatever was coming next for the man named Gault was nothing she needed to know the details of, and she was correct in that assumption. What she had not been prepared for was Raphael following her to the east wing hallway, catching the door before she closed it, and saying very quietly, "Are you all right?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true and she had learned young that the truth was generally the most efficient thing, I was scared. "But I'm all right." He studied her face. The hallway light was low and warm, and she was very aware of how close he was standing, and of the way he was looking at her, not assessing her for usefulness this time, not cataloguing her professional qualities. Something more direct than that. Something that made her stomach do a thing she firmly told it not to do. "You signaled Dumas," Raphael said. "You didn't run, you didn't panic." "Panicking doesn't help." "No," he said. "It doesn't." He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't think to tell him anything either." She heard the steel under the question and met it directly. "No. I didn't think about it for a single second. There's nothing in the world that man could have offered me or threatened me with that would have made me do that." He looked at her for a long time. The hallway was very quiet. "I believe you," he said, and the way he said it, like it cost him something to say it, like he had been holding a door closed and had just decided to open it, made her breath come slightly shorter than usual. She said good night. She closed her door. She stood against it in the dark for a moment and had a very serious internal conversation with herself about the nature of her employment and the importance of professional boundaries. And then she went to bed and did not think about it. She thought about it quite a bit. Gault was not the end of it. A week later, Fenwick told her, with his usual measured quiet, that there had been an incident at the front gate that she did not need to concern herself with. 2 days after that, Raphael tripled his security presence and cancelled Sophia's twice-weekly therapy appointments until further notice, which meant Sophia was home all day every day, which meant Bette was with her more or less constantly, which Bette found she didn't mind at all. It was on a Thursday afternoon, in the walled garden behind the house, that it happened. Bette had brought a blanket out onto the grass, and they were lying on their backs looking up at the sky. A soft, hazy New Orleans October sky, the light going gold and amber, and Bette was identifying cloud shapes the way her grandmother had taught her, naming them aloud in her unhurried way, and Sophia was lying with her small shoulder pressed against Bette's arm, which had become her preferred position over the past 2 weeks. "That one looks like a pelican," Bette said. "But not a happy pelican, a pelican who's had a long day." She felt Sophia's shoulder shake, a small, silent laugh. It was something. It was a lot, actually. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, not really expecting anything, "What do you think that one looks like?" And Sophia, very softly, barely above a breath, The sound of a door opening that hadn't been opened in 8 months said, "Dog." Bette did not move. She did not gasp. She did not turn to look at her. "Yeah," she said after a beat. "I see it. He needs a haircut." Sophia made that small, silent law shoulder shake again. Bette blinked up at the sky and pressed her lips together and took 3 very slow breaths and did not cry, which was the hardest thing she had done in a long time. They lay there for another half hour until the light went blue, and Bette did not make a single mention of what had happened, because Sophia didn't need it noted or praised or turned into a moment. She just needed to have done it. Raphael found out from the garden security camera. He watched the footage that evening in his study. The 2 of them on the blanket, the long, comfortable quiet, his daughter's single word, Bette's response, and he sat at his desk for a long time after the footage ended and stared at nothing. Then he went to Bette's door. She opened it in her robe, clearly on her way to bed, and she looked surprised for a second, and then something else. He stood in the doorway. He did not come inside. That was a line he was not crossing, and he looked at her and said, "I watched the garden footage." Bette waited. "The way you handled that," he said, not making it a thing, not startling her. She didn't need me to make it a thing, she just needed it to be real. "I haven't done that well," he said. "When I've tried to reach her, I've tried too hard. She can feel it." "You're her father," Bette said. "She's not rejecting you. She's on a longer road than other people. And the road doesn't go faster because you need it to." She paused. "She loves you. I can see it every time you walk in a room. She tracks you the way kids track the people they love. She's just not ready to be loud about it yet." Something in his face changed. He pressed his hand once against the doorframe, a brief grounding gesture, and said, "Thank you, Bette." It was the first time he'd used her first name. She did not say what she almost said, which was something inadvisable. She said, "Good night, Mr. Arcadi," and he almost smiled. She caught the edge of it, and he said good night and walked away down the hall. She closed the door and stood in the dark and thought about the edge of that almost smile for considerably longer than was sensible. What happened with Galt resolved itself in the way things resolved themselves in Raphael Arcadi's world, which is to say, it resolved completely and finally without newspaper coverage. Bette heard nothing about it and asked nothing about it. She did not need to know. She needed to make Sophia breakfast and teach her a card game Mamie Louise had taught her, and lie on the blanket in the garden and let the days accumulate into something solid. Sophia said 3 more words over the following week. More at breakfast. No, when Bette offered broccoli with dinner. And then, one afternoon in the kitchen, unprompted, she pointed at the photo on Bette's phone. Mamie Louise in her hospital chair, small and bright-eyed and smiling, and said, clear as anything, "Who is that?" Bette looked at her. "That's my grandmother," she said. "Her name's Louise. She's sick right now, but she's tough as nails. She once survived a Category 4 hurricane in this city with nothing but a deck of cards and 2 cans of Goya beans. She wins every hand she plays." She looked at the photo. "I think you'd like her." Sophia considered this for a moment. Then she went back to her coloring. That night, Bette sat on the edge of her clawfoot bathtub and counted the weeks left on Mamie Louise's bills and felt the particular loneliness of being surrounded by warmth that belonged to someone else. This house was not hers. This child, who had worked her way into Bette's heart so completely that the thought of leaving made something in her chest seize up, was not hers. And the man who walked the upstairs hallway at 11 p.m. and smelled like cedarwood and something dark and autumnal, and who looked at her like she was the first real thing he'd seen in a long time. He was absolutely, categorically not hers. She ran the bath very hot and stayed in it until the water cooled and she had sorted herself back out. She was mostly sorted when she heard the knock. She wrapped herself in her robe and opened the door, and Raphael was there, and this time his jacket was off and his collar was open and his tie was gone, and he looked, for the first time in all the weeks she'd been in this house, like a man who was tired in the way humans get tired, not just the operational tiredness of someone managing enormous and complicated things. She said 7 words today, he said. Fenwick counted. Bette smiled before she could stop it. He counted. He has a notebook. He's been keeping track. Raphael looked at her. She asked where you were at dinner. The warmth that moved through Bette at that was embarrassingly powerful. She said my name. She said the kitchen lady. Raphael said, and that edge of almost smile appeared again, bigger this time, cresting toward actual. Fenwick is going to note that also. Bette laughed, a real one, surprised out of her, and something in Raphael's face when he heard it made her look away briefly, look at the floor, collect herself. I should go to sleep, she said. Bette, Raphael said. She looked up at him. You asked for nothing, he said. You came into this house and you asked for nothing from either of us. You just showed up, every single day. He was quiet for a moment. I don't know very many people like that. She studied him. I know what I am, she said. I'm a fat girl from the Tremé who waited tables for 4 years and never went to college. I'm not naive about what I am in this house and what I'm not. What you are in this house, Raphael said, and his voice was very quiet and very sure, is the reason my daughter spoke today, the reason she slept last night, the reason this house, for the first time in almost a year, doesn't feel like a place where grief lives. He stepped closer just slightly. I am a man who has spent 20 years knowing exactly what things are worth, and I am telling you what you are worth, to this house, to that child. He paused. To me. Bette looked at him for a long time. She was not the kind of woman who had been told things like this. She had been told other things, that she was reliable, that she was helpful, that she was good with kids, that she had a nice personality. She had been told, in crueler moments, the other things, the ones she'd learned to set down and walk away from. She was not practiced at receiving what Raphael was saying, and she could feel it moving through her strangely, looking for somewhere to land. He reached out and very carefully, as if she were something he was not sure he had permission to touch, tucked a loose piece of hair back from her face. His hand was warm and certain, and it stayed there, against her cheek, and she leaned into it the smallest amount. And that was everything. When he kissed her, it was not tentative. It was the kiss of someone who has made a decision after a very long time of deciding and is not interested in half measures. She kissed him back, her hands catching the front of his shirt, and when she finally pulled back slightly to breathe, she pressed her forehead against his collarbone and felt his arms settle around her, around all of her, completely, the way people wrap themselves around something they intend to keep, and she thought about her grandmother's saying, the one Mamie Louise repeated when things felt impossibly difficult, and then suddenly became possible. Lord, you work in the most ridiculous ways, she laughed quietly against his shirt. What? He said, low, against her hair. Something my grandmother says, she said. He held her. The house was quiet. The night air through the high windows smelled like jasmine off the old brick wall. In the weeks that followed, the Accardi household noticed, because that kind of household always notices everything, that things were different. The security arrangements did not change. The morning briefings did not change. Raphael Accardi was no less precise, no less decided, no less the man who ran what he ran without apology or explanation. But he came home earlier, and he could be heard, in the kitchen after 9 p.m., talking to Bette about her grandmother's progress at Tulane Medical, improving slowly and stubbornly in the manner of the toughest women of her generation, and about Sophia's afternoon, and about nothing in particular. The sounds of someone who has decided to be in a place rather than merely occupying it. Mamie Louise's bills were settled, quietly, through Fenwick, in a way that Bette discovered 6 weeks later, and had a long, very heated conversation with Raphael about in which she was largely furious, and he was largely unmoved, and the outcome was that the bills stayed settled. Sophia spoke, on an ordinary Tuesday morning in November, her first complete sentence directed at the man standing in the kitchen doorway in his charcoal suit with his coffee in his hand. "Daddy," she said, "come see what Bette made." Raphael Arcadi, who had not cried since a rainy night 11 years ago, stood in the kitchen doorway and took a very slow breath and looked at his daughter standing beside the woman in the apron who was pretending to be very busy rearranging pastries on a tray so that everyone had a moment to be human in private. He crossed the kitchen. He looked at the tray. "What did she make?" he asked Sophia in a voice that was entirely steady. Sophia picked up a small powdered beignet and held it out to him, and when Raphael Arcadi looked across that kitchen island at Bette Mouton, flour on her hands, sugar on her apron, her round face flushed warm with the heat of the oven, and the particular happiness of people who have learned to receive good things without bracing for them to be taken back. He thought that he had spent a long time believing that certain rooms in his life were simply closed now, locked from the inside by loss, inaccessible. He had not accounted for a woman who was not afraid of silence, who knew instinctively that you did not pry open locked doors. You simply sat outside them, warm and unhurried and constant, until the person on the other side decided they were ready. Sophia pressed the beignet into his hand and said, imperiously, "Eat it, Daddy." He ate it. He looked at Bette. She looked at him with those amber-brown eyes and that gap-toothed smile, and she didn't say anything, because she had known from the very beginning that the best things don't need to be announced. They just need someone patient enough to wait for them.